Welcome back, listeners, to the Arcade Attack podcast. I've got an amazing guest on today's show, a real legend. If you listen to our previous episodes, you know we're a huge fan of BioShock, and that's probably giving the game away. Really is a true honor. Ken Levine, to have you on the show. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for inviting me. I listened to some episodes and I really enjoyed it.
You're a legend. Thank you. I'm going to start with quite an open question. I reckon it's quite a tough question, and then we can go a bit more specific about some of your games, if that's right, Ken. But
sure.
You're obviously known and highly respected for your storytelling in both video games and other media. Where do you personally find the inspiration, the influences that have helped you create such, vivid stories and those amazing settings? Can you sort of run through your kind of sort of framework in your brain, for example?
Yeah, it comes from a lot of places. In terms of the games, I was highly influenced by playing. I've been a gamer since really before there were video games, and I was used to playing electromechanical games in the arcade. Most people don't remember these things, but they were cool little coin-op things that had purely mechanical elements. Basically glorified pinball. And weird gun games that use like photosensitive things that you could target. If you watch the movie Jaws, actually, there's a shark game in there, an arcade in a sequence, which is a game I used to enjoy. That was all done by just lighting up different stills, putting a light behind different still drawings of a shark. Mm-hmm. And so I got started really early. But the real game that influenced me to make the kind of games that I make now, I think, was probably Ultima Underworld, which is an old Looking Glass game, which came out about 91 probably. And that was the first time, I think it was really the first sort of immersive sim, the first of its kind. And that just really blew me away. These kind of the openness and the world building and the environment setting, and how, having come from playing games like Wizardry, where you sort of move a block at a time, or Ultima, which is sort of overhead view. This was a first-person game that was free form, really a predecessor to what first-person shooters in a lot of ways became. They went in a different direction in terms of just having a free-flowing first-person environment. That was hugely inspirational. Then, of course, the first System Shock, which I didn't work on, but I was very inspired by that. And so by the time I got to make System Shock 2, I was really ready to go. But then outside of games, I'm a bit of a film nerd, so there's especially films like films of the 70s and films of the 90s. I think there's this cycle where people grow up with films they're inspired by, and they tend to, so there's this 20-year gap where you have this cyclical nature. So the 70s filmmakers came out of an era of sort of calcified filmmaking in the 60s, and those movies weren't selling anymore. So they handed a bunch of young bucks the reins to make ended up getting The Godfather and Apocalypse Now and Taxi Driver and all those great films of the 70s that were, quite, a lot of anti-heroes and have a very cynical cast on the view of the world. But my big film was not sort of a strange film that was not super well remembered, but a film called Logan's Run was the first real dystopia story, utopia/dystopia story I ever saw. And that movie, I was just obsessed with that story when I was a kid. That was my first exposure. But then when in high school, then a few years later, I was exposed to George Orwell and Aldous Huxley and Brave New World in 1984 and Animal Farm. And I continued my sort of real fascination with, these sort of political, social ideas that those things brought into science fiction. And I was really, I love the world building of those, stories. They really had, unlike some science fiction stories where there's Martians invade, like Starship Troopers, which is another book I really liked. It was really about the world that these ideas created, and quite the dark worlds they created. And I was just fascinated by the kind of world building those books did. And I really wanted to take that kind of lens to storytelling. And it didn't really even occur to me until I got into games that I could do that. So I had written a bunch of early screenplays that none of them were really anything like what I do now. They were sort of more action films, and I wrote like a romantic comedy for Paramount, which is like nothing like I'm known for at all. And it wasn't very good, to be honest. But those are the books that really inspired me. And I think I was taken from those kind of novels and those kind of movies and those kind of games. They all sort of merged into becoming, what System Shock and BioShock were.
So cool. Did any of your screenplays make it to the big screen, Ken? Can I ask?
No. I've sold about in my life, I think, 3 or 4, and none of them have actually made it to the big screen. It was just strange because like the first 2 games I worked on we had a bunch of ideas. There's a documentary that Danny O'Dwyer did on Thief, and you can see sort of the amount of ideas that came up before it became Thief. But when we started Irrational, System Shock 2 was our first game, and it was unlike the film industry, which has this thing called development hell, where you could be, as a screenwriter, years and years and years go by, and you write screenplay after screenplay. Really, the first game I worked on from start to finish got out there, and that was great. And it's been a much more satisfying career for me too, because there's a much more direct line, and I've had a lot more agency in my career as a game maker than as a screenwriter.
Good stuff. Really appreciate the answer, Ken. Thank you. Let's talk about Thief. Was that the first game you properly worked on, the first published title, or was there any games before? Or yeah.
Yeah, I worked on a bunch of things at Looking Glass. There was a Star Trek game, a Star Trek Voyager game that I worked on that got canceled. But I didn't work on it for that long. And then we had a bunch of, the Thief was a bunch of different game ideas before it became Thief, but they all shared a common element, which was this notion of it would be cool to be walking around a world and hear an AI, talk in the world and say, is somebody there? And that's not something that really existed in games before. Maybe Metal Gear had the initial sort of impulses of AI awareness ramping up. We sort of took that notion and of having AIs that their whole awareness arcing up and down was this whole cycle you go through. And that was really good for stealth, right? Because you were getting a lot more feedback. That element really remained through all those game ideas. And, Danny O'Dwyer's, documentary on Thief covers a lot of this more in depth than I have time to go into now, but so people are interested, they should watch that. But yeah, there was a game called Better Red Than Undead. There was a game called Dark Camelot. There was a game called Our Dark Elves Must Die. We had all these ideas that were really cool, and it was cool, but I had to build a different world setting for each of them. So I got real practice in building worlds, at least 5-7 page pitch documents with the world and mechanics and all that. And the guy I was working with, my mentor figure at the time, was Doug Church at Looking Glass, and he just, we talk about him for a while, and then he'd end up saying, "No, this isn't going to work," and I'd have to learn very, very quickly to bounce back from rejection. And I think he was right in all those cases. Like, I think we came up with the Thief was the best of those ideas. It was the most unified of all those ideas. And, but it was a very good lesson. I think it's an important lesson for young developers to learn, is that just because you wrote something or created something doesn't mean it's good, or good enough.
Yeah.
And I can go back and, and think about all those things that they were good and they had their strengths, but we actually came up with something better. And it really gave me the most important lesson in games, which I think a lot of developers struggle with, which is you got to throw out your work. As a writer, there's a saying, writing is rewriting. And it's a luxury in the games industry to be able to do that. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to have that luxury. And I think most of the reason that if the work is good that I do, it's because I've been able to say, no, this isn't working, and move on and throw it out. And that can come across as indecisiveness. And I can definitely see why people feel that way. But for me, it's why I don't know another way to get there. But it also requires you to be willing to pick up that pen again and start over. And I think it's critical. I view it as a luxury.
Man, wow. And I was going to ask if Thief kind of helped you in your future career, and obviously you just answered that. So Ken, it obviously made a big influence in it. Yeah. I
don't think it helped me in my career from you worked on Thief, so you're going to get this. I think System Shock 2 was that did that for me.
Yeah.
But it helped me understand that just because you think it's cool doesn't necessarily mean it's cool enough.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
and I still have some of those designs, like Dark Camelot. I think I have a design document for that somewhere. But we made the best. I think Looking Glass went on to make the right, use the right concept, which is better than the others.
I was a fan of System Shock as well, Ken, just like yourself. And I remember playing it and thinking, this is different to Doom and Duke Nukem 3D. It just felt a bit more mature and a bit sort of darker. I mean, you said already you're a fan. How did you get the opportunity to work on the sequel? Are you happy to sort of fill in the time between Thief and System Shock 2?
So Thief, I left. Look, while I was working on Thief, I left to form Irrational because I was concerned about the companies. I was terrified of. I viewed getting into games. I was 29. This was sort of my second. I had already sort of tried to be a screenwriter. It didn't really work out. So I had a few years in the wilderness and, doing jobs that weren't creative. And while I got by, as a computer consultant and a graphic designer and a bunch of other random jobs, I was disappointed because I was this sort of wunderkind. I was winning all these, playwriting awards when I was young. And then I got an agent when I was like 19 or 20. And I was, and then all of a sudden all that was gone. And, I can sense my parents' disappointment in me, and all that other stuff. And so when I was worried, I got this job at Looking Glass, which I couldn't believe I was lucky enough to get. But then I started to get worried about Looking Glass's sort of financial health, even though it was like, from a creative standpoint, it was second to none. I had run a business myself, and I know I know that businesses. I think a lot of times people at jobs think the business is just going to be there forever, and I knew enough to see some warning signs that the business was struggling, and so this is probably naivete. I and a couple other people from Looking Glass started Irrational, thinking we could keep the design aesthetic, but maybe have a stronger, maybe have a more stable, try to build a more stable business platform at the same time. And, that was pretty naive at the time, because why would we, having marginal experience, why would we be able to do that? And I think we got a bunch of lucky and unlucky breaks along the way, but here we are, still, even Ghost Story is an evolution of Irrational, but, here I am still running the group, 20 some odd years, almost 25 years later. And, and we were able to keep it going. But, we left and we started Irrational. Got our first gig, which got canceled after like 3 weeks. And then I was just like in this panic that I'd blown my second shot at creative career. Yeah. And fortunately, we got called by Looking Glass, who they wanted to do a second game on their Thief engine because they want to amortize the cost of that. And they asked us if we had any ideas. So we pitched something that we called Shock at the time, which was basically like System Shock 2, but they didn't have the rights to it. EA had the rights to it. And they pitched it. And so it was different. Like, it didn't have Shodan in it. It was kind of different. It was very much like an Apocalypse Now storyline. There was a military commander set in the future who had gone kind of crazy, and you were an assassin basically hired to go on this crazy spaceship, and where he had completely gone off the deep end and go to this really strange world and try to take him down. And then we pitched that. We built a very crude prototype of that in the Dark Engine, this was in 1997. So Thief it was a year from coming out, and Thief was one of those games, like many games, people don't really understand this, that basically there was no game until a couple of months before it came out. Like, they finally figured out the technology wasn't working properly. It all sort of came together in the last couple of months. And, I say this from hearing from the people who worked on it. That's my understanding of what happens. I'd stopped working on it at that point. But it was, it was heady days. There wasn't the kind of, there's no Unreal Engine 5 and there was no digital distribution. Like, the industry you're building an engine back then. You're building your own, everybody's building their own engine. Everybody's writing their own sound drivers. Everybody's writing their own memory management and all that stuff from back in the DOS days. And everybody was sort of going by the skin of their teeth. And So we built this very crude prototype in this very sort of semi-functional engine, but it was enough. It had a good atmosphere to it, and it was enough to get a deal. So Paul, who ran Looking Glass, was pitching it out to EA and Microsoft and like IOS, I think, and EA bit on it. And fortunately, because they bit, we got the rights to make it a System Shock game. And once I knew I had Shodan,
wow,
I was not going to walk away from that, because Shodan to me was the best video game villain I'd ever seen by a long shot. And so I knew I was going to make the game, and I knew Shodan had to be the heart of it, that relationship with Shodan. And we were off to the races.
The stars aligned, didn't they,
Yeah,
to get System Shock 2?
As I said, luck. Luck is, I think hard work and talent are fine. They're necessary, but you have to be there when the luck comes around, right? So that's what it is. You work really, really, really hard. And so you may, if you're lucky, be there when that lucky break happens. And then, we had to get the game, and then we had to make it, right? And then the game had to be good. And that was more of the talent of the team. And I think we all knew we had a very limited period of time, and we knew it had to be good, because if we blew it, we didn't think there'd be any other big chances coming. So we just did our best, and we were pretty shocked by the reception, frankly, because we were, it's another game too that was very broken until very near the end. And it even the second half of the game, I think, struggled in terms of we ran out of time, and the second half of the game isn't as good as the first half because we had to focus our energy somewhere.
It was critically, hugely acclaimed. It was really well respected, but it didn't sell. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it didn't sell that well. Why do you think it wasn't really maybe as successful as it was critically acclaimed?
It's hard to say. I think most games, it's really a question of why games sell rather than why games don't sell, because most great things fail to find an audience, or most things fail to find an audience. System Shock it helped our careers greatly, because a lot of the people who mattered played it, like people at development, at executives at publishers, and journalists loved it. The game press loved it, and certain fans loved it. And people who found it, loved it, tend to love it a lot. Like, it wasn't like, oh, I like this, it's okay. It's like, wow, I really, really like this. It was a small group of people who was very important to. And I think we're probably better off than selling twice as much, but nobody really attaches to it. It's sort of like Avatar, right? Avatar is a movie that sold really well, but it doesn't really have a cultural impact, versus, say, The Terminator, right? Which, Cameron also made, which had, or Titanic even, which had, a big cultural impact. So it had a big cultural impact on a very small group of people. But why didn't it sell? I think it's really the other question is, why does anything sell? At the time, maybe it was like, I remember showing it to my parents, and they, back then, as a gamer, did you play it? You're much younger, so you were probably pretty young, or how old were you when that came out?
Yeah, I was a teenager then, so I haven't really played the second one much. I played the first System Shock, truthfully, Ken. I'm not going to lie to you, but
right, that's fine.
Yeah.
But if you look at it as a gamer, you can sort of see what's happening, but the graphics are so crude that if you're not a gamer, you're trying to suss out a story from it.
Yeah,
it's hard to tell. So it didn't have that high intensity action gameplay. It was very story oriented, but for people interested in story, I think it took really to BioShock came around, where the graphics were sophisticated enough where somebody who's not a hardcore gamer can look at it and be like, oh, I understand the world here. I understand what the visual is trying to get across to me. Because my parents saw BioShock, and they could understand, oh, I see this city at the bottom of the ocean with Art Deco elements, and it looks kind of like Rockefeller Center in New York, because they were the ones who had taken me there, as a kid, and inspired me, which with the look of the game comes from this particular set of 4 blocks in New York. But I think, it was hard to read to most people. So heavy story games at that point were a bit of a sell. Where a game like Quake, multiplayer game, the iconic, visually simplistic, iconic nature of it makes much more sense in a multiplayer-oriented game like that.
Were you a fan of those kind of Dooms and Duke 3Ds, or was it really not your cup of tea? Those kind of all action FPS games, or?
Well, I like the single player. I'm not really a multiplayer gamer because I don't have very good. Like I'm not actually my secret shame is I play games all the time. I'm not good at them. Like people are like, oh, I finished that game in like 12 hours. I'm like, oh, it took me like 35 hours to finish it. And so I play games all the time. I play games every day. And like, like I always have right now, I always have a game in the background. So he's running like Slay the Spire is always running in the background for me or Inscription recently. And I talk to people who finish it and like, Inscription, I'm like, get to the end in like 8 hours. And I'm like, I've been playing for like 25 hours and I haven't gotten to the end. So I don't like playing multiplayer games just because I'm not very good at them, but I also like immersion in games. So I'd rather, for my personal taste, I'd rather play something that's, either more story oriented or more vibe oriented, or just more systemically oriented where I can really be doing those min-maxing decisions. So no, I don't play a lot of multiplayer games. So I love the single player Doom and I love the single player, Duke Nukem, especially the world building in Duke Nukem. That was ahead of its time.
Yeah, I used to do that as a kid. Make the levels are so cool. System Shock 3, I'd love to know if you started to work on that game, and did that evolve into BioShock, or is that the kind of transition?
No, it didn't evolve. I had ideas for System Shock 3, which I started working on after System Shock 2 shipped, which involved this, Shodan having a child of sorts. And I can't remember the details, but it was something about, did that child become like Shodan or does it become something more benevolent than Shodan? I think. And I think my reference point for that is I tend to have a reference point for games I work on, like, BioShock is sort of a Robinson Crusoe story, right? It's a castaway at sea. You end up on a strange desert island. This was, I think, sort of like a Moses story. Like, you're the son of the Pharaoh, and, or Shodan. And, you see, and you become more like, your brother, like, in the Moses story, the son of the, you had a brother, Moses had a brother who, was a real son of the Pharaoh Moses adopted. Or do you become, do you break away? And it was sort of based on that, but I wish I could remember more of the details, but I can't. And it just never went anywhere. And now BioShock was a completely different beast.
Oh, fair enough. No, thank you. Ken, you kind of mentioned it earlier. You said that you went with your parents. But how exactly did you first sort of envisage BioShock? Was it like a eureka moment, or was it things that sort of I'd love to get your early ideas how this sort of game and setting came to life.
The big two eureka moments were very separate from each other, and both sort of conceptually and time-wise. So the first idea I had for BioShock, the team wanted to do another System Shock 2 style game, but I was very reluctant because I was the guy who had to go out and make the deals. And I knew the appetite for it because the first game didn't sell very well, wasn't very good. So I was oriented towards keeping the company alive, which was at that time very difficult to do. You had to make deals with publishers, and there had to be enough money in those deals. And if you were late or something, you can end up in really hot water, and the company was always on the brink of always on the brink of extinction. And it was my job to make that not go into extinct. So I pushed against it, and the team, to their credit, kept pushing for it because I think a lot of people came to the company because they loved System Shock 2 and they wanted to make something like that. So I didn't really have an idea for it. So one night I was watching a nature show, and it was, I can't remember what the animals were, but it was some mother animal and a baby animal, and there was a predator out there, and the mother was fighting off the predator. And I remember watching it and being like, oh, you can watch this. Well, obviously there's no words, right? Because there were three animals. I can't remember which animals they were. But you knew exactly what's happening, right? You understood that relation. There's a predator, there's a protector, and there's a child. And I said, these would make really interesting AI types because there's a story being told here that is immediately gettable with, and no words are necessary. And I really like visual storytelling, coming from a screenwriting background. And I sort of went in, I had that idea, and we started kicking those ideas around. And eventually that's the thing, over a long period of time, became the Big Daddy and Little Sister, and the Splicers. But from what the world was, we had an idea for a city at the bottom of the ocean, just because, like a spaceship, you can't get out of it. You can't leave it. So we like these sort of worlds that can evolve in a petri dish. And so we had this idea about a bottom of the ocean, and it went through a bunch of concepts. But then I was in New York with my wife at Rockefeller Center. We were really trying to find a striking visual. And Rockefeller Center, for those of you who haven't been there, is sort of a 4 square block area, like this plaza in New York. That's all designed by either by a single architect or exactly in the same architectural style, which is Art Deco. It's where you have the big skating rink and the Christmas trees lit there. But if you go there, it's this extraordinary mini world, because New York, like London, is a combination of artistic styles, right? Or most cities, they're a combination. It's a bit of a hodgepodge over time. Just different buildings come up and whatever the time period it is. But Rockefeller Center is a unified world. And it's very rare. And it's on a scale that you very rarely see in a city. And so I got really excited. And I thought, well, not only was it cool, looked beautiful, but the shapes are rather simple. Art Deco is made up of rather simple geometric shapes. And so from the rendering standpoint, I knew we could do it. Because games are, especially then, even so now, they're still a fairly low resolution medium compared to real life. In movies, because the kind of close-ups you can do and the kind of detail you can focus on in a movie you can't really get to in a game, unless you use very specific techniques, like in first-person games, your character picking up something and putting it right in front of your eyes. So in first-person games, you're always at a fair distance from things usually, because you unless you really put it up at the camera. And so I liked that. It was striking. It felt like there's also a statue of Atlas holding up the globe outside, which is they actually put on a cover of one of the editions of the Fountainhead, of Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead, which is the book that sort of inspired the Andrew Ryan character and the philosophy for the city, and all those things that sort of went off like ding, 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 ding in my head. And I came back, and my wife and I bought these disposable cameras they had back then, because we didn't have their cell phones didn't have cameras really then, or good ones, and we just used up all the film in those cameras, taking pictures of everything, down from the facade of the building down to like what a door handle or what a lighting fixture would look like, to a floor tile, to a desk, to everything. And we brought it back to the team. Like, okay, I think this is it. And the art team, took it up immediately and were great. And they started figuring out how to turn it into something. And we focused on the space that became the restaurant that you have. Very early in the game, you come into this restaurant called the Kashmir Restaurant, right past where the woman with the baby carriage, the spice for the baby carriage. You go into this room, and we just started working on that room, and we stayed in that room for like a period of a couple of months of just trying to get it right. And we kept, throwing things out, going and focusing. And once we had that room right, then we started expanding out and populating the rest of the game with that look. But it was like one of those, eureka moments that came from just being in the world, and seeing that space. And I did that space, 100 times before in my life, but I always liked it. I always had an attachment to it, but I never really, thought of using it in a meaningful way in a game.
When you go back, is it weird when you go back since the game, or is it just?
It's not weird, because I've been there so many times before, but I do have probably a stronger attachment to that space now, because, it was like a gift from the heavens to be given an aesthetic that clear. And I have to honor obviously all the artists who came forward and developed that style, and the artists who made that space. But I hope wherever they are, they know that audiences today, not only people go to the space, but gamers who never have a chance to go to that space, are still being inspired by their work.
Amazing. I'm sure they would really appreciate that. You mentioned earlier about, you got into George Orwell, and history was part of BioShock. I'd love to know, is there any other media that helped make BioShock? So I've heard that Resident Evil games was a bit of inspiration. Is that fair? Or is there any other video games you got ideas from? Or
Resident Evil, the first one, I remember, had a really good, strange vibe. I don't think it was inspirational in the sense that more on System Shock, where sort of the the sort of limited resources aspect of Resident Evil can create a lot of tension. And I realized that playing Resident Evil, that you'd find a couple of bullets every now and then. You have to really think very carefully about each one you use. but not as much in terms of the big picture elements. It's much more coming from the Looking Glass games and doing System Shock and wanting to build from there. So yeah, I think it had more inspiration on System Shock too than it did BioShock.
Fair enough. I mean, Rapture is famous. It's one of the most iconic locations in a video game, and I have to say I was blown over when I first went into Rapture. Can you describe how you wanted BioShock to make the player feel when they and the emotions you wanted to evoke when they were playing, when they first walked into Rapture and got really into the story, for example?
Well, I think this is from my own life. As a kid, I grew up near New York, not in New York, but near. I was born in New York, and I grew up in northern New Jersey, which is not very far from New York. So my dad worked in New York, and I spent a lot of time there. My grandmother lived in Queens, and we had a lot of family members there. And there was sort of this. My dad worked in the Diamond District, 47th Street, and there was this very sort of, at that time when I was a kid, because I was born in 1966, there was a lot of the Jewish immigrant culture, of the old world. My grandmother's native language was Yiddish, not English. And so there's a lot of Yiddish being spoken, a lot of that sort of diaspora feeling, Jewish diaspora, European diaspora feeling in Eastern Europe kind of feeling that I remember going to delis and bakeries and this sort of sights and sounds and the feel of that world. I used to go to Broadway shows a lot. My parents take me, and that a lot of sort of Broadway is built by a lot of European refugees, and so I kind of, and then also the experience of going to New York in the 70s, in the early 80s, when the streets, they sort of emptied the mental institutions because they stopped funding them, and you had a lot of very people with a lot of mental health issues on the streets. They just kind of abandoned them to the streets. And remember as a child, this sort of non-understanding, so when you're a kid, you just see those, people who are experiencing these traumas. You just see it as scary when you're a kid, right? Because you don't understand. And so there's the splicers over my me channeling my childhood fears and reactions to people. But then as an adult, I want to give the splicers that very human background, because they're tragic stories, right? They're not monsters. There are these tragic stories in them. And so when you find their audio logs and when you hear them talking about, they're talking to people who aren't there, as an adult, as I got older, I realized that was tragedy, not horror. And so I think the tragic feeling of lost, and all those people kind of felt like, there's some kind of lost greatness to them, right? Because their mental health issues overtook whatever life they had. And so they were having experience of, in their head, they were sort of on the streets, people, especially people, I think with schizophrenia, for instance, they were seeing and hearing things that weren't always necessarily there and having conversations with people who weren't necessarily there. And they were sort of trapped in this past. And I try to, so all these things, my childhood experiences in New York, all sort of merged and became this experience of Rapture. And so it is kind of a child's view of New York in the 70s and the early 80s. But obviously we transported it back in time a little bit because the people I knew, but the people in, the city were about the same age as the people who were, Andrew Ryan was born about the same time my grandfather was, right, turn of the century. And he was 60-ish in the time period of the game. And the characters were sort of in that age range. So I was really writing about my grandparents' generation, and who had fled Europe for various reasons, either whether it's the Russian Revolution or the Holocaust, or just in search of greater opportunities. And so it was sort of a love letter to them, and a reconstruction of my feelings as a kid of experiencing New York and all those people, and not quite understanding their experiences, but that sense of wonder and fear and all those other elements that combine when you're a kid exposed to all that stuff.
Wow, that's incredible. Thank you for sharing that. Ken, I've actually asked you this question before. You very kindly answered a couple of questions on a sort of live Twitter, but I just know our listeners would love to hear this. But if you had the opportunity to ever visit Rapture in real life, let's imagine it actually existed, would you take up that invitation?
Yeah, I remember you asked me. We met on a Twitter Spaces thing, right? Yeah, I like to visit it briefly. It's, I think moving there would be a tricky proposition. It's pretty dangerous. Probably doesn't smell great. That's the thing, probably it's good we couldn't get across in the game, because everything, you ever been in a waterlogged space for a long period of time, it tends to not end up not smelling excellent. But certainly it would be amazing to spend a little time there. But I kind of feel I have been there,
Yeah.
And I'm okay with that knowledge. It feels like a real place to me.
Brilliant. And it's absolutely incredible setting. Obviously, we haven't really spoken about it. BioShock is obviously known for about the RPG elements. You can improve yourself, you can improve your weapons, you can sort of change yourself with plasmids and Adam and stuff and so forth. I mean, was that a really important part of the game you wanted to bring in? And was there any ideas that just didn't make it into the final cut of the game, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was a differentiating factor. Like System Shock 2 had the sort of, sonic powers thing in it, but it was never really, it was good and interesting, but it didn't work in the combinatorial way, that we were able to do with the plasmids. And also we didn't really have the environmental effects.
Yeah.
The environmental effects were actually something I really was pushing for back even in the Looking Glass days. I used to, when I got there, I would just sit there and write documents. I write like white papers and proposals for systems. I would just keep writing stuff. And so one thing I came up with, I mean, I conceptually came up with it. I had no ability to conceive it, to prototype it or anything because I'm not a programmer. But it was a system called Act React. And that was basically like, could you give things properties? And it was inspired by like in Ultima Underworld, you could take like a fish and put it on the fire and eventually become a cooked fish. Nice. And I love that moment. Like, and that was 1991. But I really want to expand upon that, where things have sort of gettable, knowable properties, like fire would melt ice. Fire would burn things or melt ice, or ice could put out fire. And all these other things that you could apply to objects in the game, and the player would be able to then start experimenting with those, understanding the basic principles of very primal principles like fire and ice, etc. And then you keep building on these systems, and once they all know how to act with each other or react to each other, hence Act React, you could have the player have more experimental approach to gameplay. So with plasmids, at first we were working on it, and they were much more sort of like more traditional RPG, like System Shock 2, like this causes fire damage, and this character has 22% vulnerability to fire damage, and it was very under the hood. But then we really started pushing it more in this Act React direction, where the game would sort of say yes to the player. Like if the player expected to be able to do something, the player would be able to do it as much as it could. And so it moved away from sort of RPG fireball does this kind of damage onto like, okay, the world just sort of behaves the way you'd expect it to. Then we come up with ideas like when an AI was on fire, he'd jump in the water, and ice doors and all those other things, electrical stuff, projecting through the water. And we just kept expanding that vocabulary. And I think it was probably the most innovative from a game, besides the Big Daddy, was probably the most innovative part of that game. And not that nobody ever done those powers before, but we figured out a way to make it feel just a little more grounded.
I'd agree. I want to quickly talk about the big twist in the game, the big story. Was that always? Did you come up with that when you were early days, or because I wasn't expecting it? I'll be honest.
There's no such thing as always in a game, right? Because as I said, like you get one idea about it from a nature show, and it's not like all of a sudden Rapture and everything, the clouds parted. The twist, I don't remember exactly. I know we did it fairly. We came up with the idea before we had written a lot of the script because that scene was extremely complex at the time. That was a big cutscene for us at the time, the Andrew Ryan reveal scene. And we hadn't done anything on that scale before. And we had a plan ahead of time. So I had to write it very early. I didn't even know exactly how it would work in the story. I just had this, I just wrote it. And it stayed pretty much exactly the same. after I wrote it, the Would You Kindly scene, I think as people call it now. And remember Sean Robertson and I, who was the animation director at that point. Now he's our art director. I think he was the animation director at the time. His titles changed a couple of times, but we actually had an actor who wasn't Armin Shimmerman come in, because we hadn't even cast Armin yet, and sort of I think we hadn't cast Armin yet, and or maybe we did, and he acted to the vocal performance, and he sort of did not a motion capture, for instance. That technology it existed, we just didn't have access to it. We had some motion capture in System Shock 2, very crude motion capture. He sort of acted it out, and then we used that as a basis to build the animations off of. And but that had to be done really early, so I didn't know how I was going to get there at the time. So I had to sort of solve how to get there, because we were committed to that scene. And I think, as much as I said, before, it's really good to be able to throw away work. Sometimes you can't throw away work. You're forced to, to make it work. And I think that was a case where I had to sort of make it work, and we had to then figure out how to get to that point. And it took a while, but I think we eventually paved a path to it.
I bet you, I bet you've heard lots of stories about how that tricked people that weren't expecting. I bet you've heard many people, many fans, and mention how much, because it shocked me. I couldn't believe it. It was so great.
Well, we have done it's important when you do those scenes, I think, to not just have it be a shock to the character. It has to be a shock to the player for them to really, and it has to basically not just challenge the character's understanding of the world, but the player's understanding of the world. And so the fact that, it was, and I don't know, I never played it like anybody else. Like, I'm the last person to ask to some degree, because it was never a surprise to me. Except maybe the moment, when I thought of it, of the idea that that's the only moment you get as a writer is, and sometimes those ideas just, either you work them out, and I can't remember how it came about, but I had seen The Manchurian Candidate and Fight Club were very inspirational movies for me. And the notion of really, when you watch Fight Club, and I'll speak of Fight Club, there's probably more of the audience familiar with that, The Manchurian Candidate.
Fight Club, great film.
When you learn the twist in that, it makes you reconsider your entire experience with the movie. And when you go back and watch it again, you realize that your understanding, the person you were when you watched it the first time is not the same person you are the second time you watch it. And that's an amazing trick to pull on an audience. And with BioShock, we really wanted to have the player have to reconsider their entire experience. And also, I think, for bonus points, we try to get to can they really examine their relationship to video games on top of that? And I think that we were kind of shocked. I think my two biggest shocks in my life were System Shock getting as well received as it was, because we had never, shipped anything before. And then BioShock, that twist working as well, and the people getting it, because it's pretty strange and esoteric. And the people understood it was also about video games, not just about the story of Rapture. I think we were lucky, but also I think we put our faith in gamers, and that they were more sophisticated than a lot of people might think they were. And so that they could go with this and understand that it existed not just in a story sense, but it's sort of in a meta commentary sense, and would reward them for their knowledge and understanding of games and the experience of having played a lot of games.
Unbelievable. I mean, that's a great answer. I want to talk about BioShock Infinite, if you don't mind, Ken. But you didn't. Did you work much on BioShock 2? I don't want you to speak too long about this, but is it true that
not at all? Not at all.
Yeah,
I didn't even see it before it came out, so
right.
I didn't have any involvement with it.
So I guess BioShock Infinite for you was the game after, in your personal opinion.
Yeah.
I mean, what was that like working on? Was that like a whole different setting? Was it completely different? sort of ambition for you? Or?
I think my ambition at that time was to make something on a scale that I hadn't done before. Real kind of blockbuster storytelling thing, to make a game that could put up there with the big boys like Call of Duty and things like that. And I'm not sure that was the best idea from a development standpoint, because I'm not sure that was my skill set, right? So I think there are things in it that I really love. And it's very beautiful, and I love the world building. But there was a challenge, like for instance, just the notion that the world was still going and alive, and we didn't really have the budget or time to do like a real living world, like an Assassin's Creed style world, And also, I think we ended up doing sort of a half measure to get to that. And we had a lot of characters, but they were sort of more like animatronics in the world. And originally the game wasn't like that. Originally the game was much more like BioShock, where you're coming into a world that had gone through some catastrophe. And the end of the game is more like that. And I think we sort of bit off a lot. But I think the thing that did work really well is Elizabeth. And I was very happy with that, to create a companion character that you really invested in. Mm-hmm. And I think the themes, the sort of where the themes ended up about the lighthouses and the whole loop with BioShock, I was very happy with. Mm. But I think from the gameplay standpoint and from a world building standpoint, I think I set out maybe not necessarily with the greatest amount of wisdom in terms of what my goals were at the time. But I was very happy with parts of it.
Thank you. And I don't want to bring up bad memories, but you've said in previous interviews that you found BioShock Infinite that might impact your health a little bit in a negative way. How do you reflect back on that time? Would you have done things a lot differently, or do you think it's almost part of part of your career? Or
I think that I'm glad I did it. I think that it was running a team of that size, or being responsible for a project of that size with that many people on it. Some people are cut out for that. Like Rod Ferguson came in, sort of late in the day to really help get the product across the finish line. And Rod's really, really, really good at that. I think he can manage a team of any size. There was a lot of challenges to managing a team that size. When you don't know everybody on the team, like that's really strange. I don't have that anymore. Like I have a much smaller team, and we do a lot more outsourcing. And I know everybody, and that's really, really, really helpful. And so there were things on the product going on that I just had no idea. And so I don't think I would. I think I reacted to it by saying maybe I shouldn't do that again, because I also, having a ship that big and having a fixed ship date was very, 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 very challenging. And at some point, we just couldn't move that date anymore, and it wasn't good for anybody. It certainly wasn't good for me too. It wasn't good for anybody. But it took me a few years to recover from that experience. Yeah, but I'm doing much better now.
Well, I don't mean to bring up bad memories. Apologies in that sense. Obviously, BioShock 4, which we think something called BioShock Isolation, is going to come out relatively soon. Have you got any opinions about that? The sort of pictures you've seen so far? Do you know any information, the direction? Are you happy the game's being made, for example?
I know it's I'm same as BioShock 2. I'm not involved with it at all. So I try to. I don't want to do half measures. Like I never want to be half in, or half out. So. I wish them the best, and they're, I know as much about the game as anybody else, essentially. And I'll play it as a player when it comes out. But right now I've not been involved with it at all, so I don't really know anything about it.
Fair enough. Obviously, right at the start of the interview, you spoke about your screenplay career, and there was a big BioShock movie that was in production, I believe, or at least pre-production. I'd love to know, because obviously it hasn't been made. I don't know if it will be made, but were you involved in that? Were you writing the screenplay for that film? And would you be happy to share a few more details about how far that movie went along?
That was another situation where I would have liked to have been more involved with it, but I was sort of not really brought into it. I had some conversations with Gore, but I never saw the script. All that art that came out, they never showed it to me. I think there's a reason why why studios might do that is they don't want the feedback from the team, because sometimes the goals of the filmmakers are not the same of the people who built the franchise.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that's a good thing, right? Like, I think that when there is strong interaction, the first few seasons of Game of Thrones are very close to the books, and they made very smart choices. And I think that you want something that really feels like it embraces and honors the thing, though it doesn't necessarily have to be a slavish, especially in a video game. You really can't do a slavish beat by beat, because a lot of times you just be running around shooting things. But I think there was a story they wanted to tell, which wasn't necessarily the story of BioShock. And sometimes, especially now, because you need a big IP to get the money to make something, because right now, if you look at the way Hollywood movies are made, most things come from some reference material, because Hollywood doesn't really trust itself to conceive things anymore. So if you have a book or a comic or a game, that's much easier to get something made. So I think it was more a function of they wanted, I think people like the visuals of the world, but they weren't necessarily bought into like the story and the characters as they were. And so what I had heard about it, I felt wasn't necessarily going in the right direction. And so at some point it was sort of up to me of, do they continue, were they going to continue on with it? And, I was very fortunate that the company was like, you're willing to give me that authority. And I felt they were going to make a movie that may have been a good movie. I had no way of knowing that, but it wouldn't have been BioShock. And so we stopped it.
Wow. Well, fair play. I mean, I guess we'll never know. You don't think it's ever going to be made now, I assume. Do you think that's kind of...
I don't know. Like, I hope if it ever gets made, it's, I don't want to see it made unless it's
perfect. Yeah.
Unless it's good, and whether it's going to make the people who played the game feel like that that the things they loved in it are intact.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then somebody's not just like, I had a meeting once with a filmmaker, a very well-known filmmaker, I won't say his name, and he's a very talented filmmaker, and all these people we interact with are very talented, and they all want to make a good movie, I'm sure, right? But do they want to make BioShock is another question. And he said, the first question he asked me, he goes, Ken, I really love this, but does it have to be underwater? And that was, and he's not a guy who ended up working on any of the versions of the film, but that's kind of the question you get, because directors are looking for an IP they can attach to so they can get the funding. And they don't necessarily, and look at also the people who are now making big films, a lot of them are older and they don't play games, right? So it's usually my son likes this, or, I watch somebody playing it, but they don't have that experience. Like the Would You Kindly moment is a moment for gamers, right? Yeah, it's a moment that you can't experience unless you play it as a game. You can't watch that and experience that moment. You have to have them playing it. And so how do you convey that in a film? Well, that's a really tricky question, but to understand the feeling you're trying to convey, you have to have played that as a gamer. So I think it's a generational thing as well. I'm kind of old for a gamer, like I'm 55, and when I started, there wasn't a lot of gamers. It wasn't really until the 90s or early 2000s where gaming became such a broad thing. It was still pretty nichey. Even when I made System Shock 2, it was an extremely nichey field. And really the rise of the consoles is what sort of made it broader, and then Steam coming back. But I think that it's challenging to get made, and Take-Two and I think both feel that, that if it's going to get made, it has to be made in a way that is not going to be alienating to the people who love this thing.
Right. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. No, I completely agree. I'm not going to ask you about what you're working on, but you've started Ghost Story Games, and how's what? Can I ask why you started that company really briefly, and how you're feeling about it? Was it the right? I'm sure it's the right decision, but I'd just like to get your sort of mindset on the idea.
Yeah, I think we want to start by I did a talk on sort of an approach to game development people can find online called Narrative Legos. I did a talk at GDC 2014. We are trying to approach development differently in a million different ways, coming off the experience of Infinite. And that goes from like studio culture to literally how the game is built and how it's structured. I can't really go into any kind of detail. We haven't really talked about the game, and I'm not really looking to talk about it until we have something that we want to share with people, like the game itself. But I think people will be surprised but unsurprised by what they see.
Appreciate it. Yeah.
In equal measures. But it is, yeah, it's something quite interesting, and I'm looking forward to showing it to people. We didn't want to go down the path of showing it. That's another thing I think on Infinite is we showed the game too early because we thought it was going to be out sooner, and I don't want to have a long period of having to build up interest and hype because it ended up feeling fairly inauthentic, and I think that gamers want to be, they want to know what they're getting.
Yeah.
And the only way to do that really is to announce closer to launch.
Yeah, understood.
And so I think we haven't made that mistake. And it's been hard because, I get, that scene in The Big Lebowski, like, where's the money, Lebowski? Getting your head shoved in the toilet. It kind of feels like that sometimes on Twitter, like, and I don't get offended by it because it's just people loving what we do. Yeah. And like, I'll make some comment about something else and be like, where's the fucking game, Levine? And I'm not hurt by that or offended by that at all because I get it. Like, I know when I'm waiting for my favorite artist or whatever to come out with a new album or movie. Yeah. I want it, but we just don't want to go out there and show something that won't end up being completely representative of the final game as much as we can. And so it's been hard because we haven't been able to share any news with our fans for a very long time. And I think a lot of people are like, what are they doing there? Are they just sitting around doing nothing? And I understand that, but we are checking on a very challenging project, but I can promise you it's being worked on every single day. And we're very excited about it.
I can't wait. I've got two final questions, and it's been such a great interview, Ken, so I do really appreciate it. And actually, I think the next question is really tough. I've asked this to many of our guests before, and they do struggle. Do you have a top personal free video games of all time that you've played growing up or even now? What would you list in your top three?
And they're weird because they don't tend to be like, I tend to be known for narrative games, but I don't tend to play as many narrative games. I tend to like Civilization and XCOM. I sort of put out as two sides of a coin of very system-oriented, open-ended strategy games that have a lot of different. Every game is different. Yeah. XCOM especially, sort of combining the tactical and strategic, and very rare case where there's a game reconceived and it's just as good as the original. What Jake Solomon did with Julian Gallup's original design, and they're both amazing games. Ultima Underworld probably had a huge impact on me, and System Shock, System Shock 1 I'll put in the same sort of same side of the coin as well. Yeah. And I don't know. Maybe the original Castle Wolfenstein. That was before the id game. There was a game in the 80s and 70s called maybe the early 80s called Castle Wolfenstein on the Apple II, which is really one of the early stealth games and very terrifying and nerve-wracking to play, and very crude by today's standards, but way ahead of its time at the time. I think those games were pretty inspirational. But there's so many. Like recently, a game I love, like the whole roguelike game series of games, whether that's Slay the Spire or Inscription is a new game I've been playing a lot, which I love. Or Inside, I think, is one of the most amazing pieces of storytelling I've ever played in a game, and it doesn't have a single word in it. I don't know if you played it.
No, check it out.
It's by the guys who did Limbo. There's so much great stuff going on in the indie space right now, so I tend to play a lot of roguelike indie games. Into the Breach, Slay the Spire, Dead Cells, Hades, tons of great indie games in that space right now. So I've really been enjoying that whole subgenre.
Bless you. Good on you. And again, quite a tough question to finish off, Ken. Just, before I do that, thank you so much for your time again. If you could share a drink with any video game character, who would you choose and why? If you could have a good chat with someone.
Oh, I think it'd have to be Elizabeth because, she's my head. She's like the daughter I never had. Right. And I'd love to meet her and get to know her better. And hopefully, if I met Elizabeth, she'd have a better life story than the Elizabeth I created. I was not a great dad to her. but she's a wonderful person and sort of, embodies a lot of the ideals I wish I had as a character. So yeah, I think it would be Elizabeth.
Oh, what a great answer. Really good luck with your projects, Ken, and really thank you for your time. It is a real honor and a privilege for us to get you on the show. And yeah, hopefully you have huge more success in the future. I'm sure you will. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you. It was a great questions. I really, really appreciate it and enjoy your podcast.